Hello, this is Ben Television News Roundup, a compilation of major stories in the week ending. Thank you for being part of the program today. I am Tunde Alabi. Prime Minister David Cameron has described Britain as an engaged nation with believes engagement with other nations is the best way to protect and advance the country's economic and national security. Mr. Cameron said these while setting out the four main areas that are of major concerns to Britain while negotiating UK's continued EU membership.
Bloomberg speech almost 3 years ago, I said the European Union faced three major challenges. First, the problems in the Eurozone. They need to be fixed, and that will require fundamental changes. Second, a crisis of European competitiveness as other nations across the world soar ahead and Europe risks being left behind. And third, a gap between the EU and its citizens, which has grown dramatically in recent years, and which represents a lack of democratic accountability and consent that is felt particularly acutely here in Britain. These three challenges are as critical now as when I first set them out. And today I would add a fourth. As we've seen so spectacularly across Europe with the questions posed by the migration crisis, countries need greater controls to manage the pressures of people coming in. And while in Britain we're not part of the Schengen No Borders Agreement, and so we've been able to set out our own approach and take refugees directly from the camps, we do need some additional measures to address wider abuses of the right to free movement within Europe and to reduce the very high flow of people coming to Britain from across all of Europe. So the changes we're arguing for are substantial, but they have a very clear purpose to address the four key challenges which are vital to the success of the European Union and to maintain and advance the UK's economic and national security within it. Now let me explain each of them in turn. First, it's in all our interests for the Eurozone to have the right governance and structures to secure a successful currency for the long term. Britain understands that, and we won't stand in the way of those developments as long as we can be sure that there are mechanisms in place to ensure that our own interests are fully protected. This is a matter of cardinal importance for the United Kingdom, because if the European Union were to evolve into a single currency club, where those outside the single currency are pushed aside and overruled, then it would no longer be a club for us. We need this issue fixed so that the UK is not obliged to fight a series of running battles which would only corrode trust amongst member states. And we have to make sure that there's a point to being in the EU but not in the Eurozone, and that position does not turn a country into a rule taker instead of a rule maker. And now is the time to do that. So as part of our renegotiation, I'm asking European leaders to agree clear and binding principles that protect Britain and other non-Euro countries, and a safeguard mechanism to ensure that those principles are respected and enforced. Those principles should include the following: recognition that the EU is a union with more than one currency, that there should be no discrimination and no disadvantage for any business on the basis of the currency of their country, that the integrity of the single market must be protected, that as the Eurozone moves ahead, any changes it decides to make, like creation of a banking union, for instance, must be voluntary for non-Euro countries, never compulsory, that taxpayers in non-Euro countries should never bear the cost for operations to support the euro as a currency, and that just as financial stability and supervision has become a key area of competence for the Eurozone and institutions like the ECB, so financial stability and supervision is also a key area of competence for national institutions, like the Bank of England, for non-Euro members. And of course, that any issues that affect all member states must be discussed and decided by all member states. So second, we want a European Union that adds to our competitiveness, not detracts from it. Now, I've already made good progress here since my speech at Bloomberg. Legislative proposals under the new Commission have fallen by 80%, with more regulations set to be repealed this year than in the whole of the previous Commission. We have proposals for a capital markets union, which will help get finance into the hands of entrepreneurs and growing businesses. The new plans to deepen the single market in services and digital will mean new opportunities for millions of British businesses to operate more easily anywhere in Europe. Changes we secured just last month will mean that British tourists will no longer incur roaming charges when they use their mobile phones or have to pay extortionate credit card fees. And just last month, the European Commission published a new trade strategy that reflects the agenda that Britain has been championing for years, including pursuing massive trade deals with America, China, Japan, and ASEAN. We know the benefits that free trade can bring. Recent deals, including one with Korea, are already saving UK consumers £5 billion every year. And they've helped UK car exports, for instance, to Korea increase fivefold. But there's much more that we can do. For all that we've achieved in stemming the flow of new regulations, the burden from existing regulation is still too high. Now, 2 years ago, we secured the first ever real terms cut in the EU budget. It's now time to do the same with EU regulation. Now, third, we need to deal with the disillusionment that many of Europe's citizens feel towards the European Union as an institution. And these concerns are not just in Britain, but they are perhaps greater here than anywhere else in the European Union today. Now, we've already passed a law to guarantee that no powers can transfer from Britain to Brussels ever again without the explicit consent of the British people in a referendum. But if Britain is to remain in the EU, we need to do more. And really, it boils down to this. We are a proud, independent nation. We intend to stay that way. So we need to be honest about this. The commitment in the treaty to an ever closer union is not a commitment that should apply any longer to Britain. We don't believe in it. We do not subscribe to it. We have a different vision for Europe. We believe in a flexible union of free member states who share treaties and institutions, working together in a spirit of cooperation to advance our shared prosperity and to protect our people from threats to our security, whether they come from home or abroad. And of course, continuing, in time and only with unanimous agreement, to welcome new countries into the EU. Now, this vision of flexibility and cooperation, it's not the same as those who want to build an ever closer political union, but it is just as valid. And if we can't persuade our European partners to share this vision for all, we certainly need to find a way to allow this vision to shape Britain's membership. So I can tell you today that as part of our renegotiation, I'm asking European leaders for a clear, legally binding and irreversible agreement to end Britain's obligation to work towards an ever closer union. People are also frustrated by some legal judgments made in Europe that impact on life in Britain. Now, of course, this relates as much to the European Convention on Human Rights as the European Union, which is why we need to act on both fronts. So we will reform our relationship with the ECHR by scrapping Labour's Human Rights Act and introducing a new British Bill of Rights. We will, of course, consult on how to make this big constitutional change. The consultation we will publish will set out our plan to remain consistent with the founding principles of the Convention while restoring the proper role of UK courts and our Parliament. And as we reform the relationship between our courts and Strasbourg, it's also right we consider the role of the European Court of Justice and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So as was agreed at the time of the Lisbon Treaty, we will enshrine in our domestic law that the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights does not create any new rights. We'll make it explicit to our courts that they cannot use the EU Charter as the basis for any new legal challenge, citing spurious new human rights grounds. Now, fourth, we believe in an open economy, but we've got to be able to cope with all the pressures that free movement can bring on our schools, our hospitals, and our public services. Right now, the pressures are too great. Now, I appreciate that at a time when other European countries are facing huge pressure from migration outside the EU, this may be hard for some other EU countries to understand. But in a way, these pressures are an example of exactly the point that the UK has been making in recent years. For us, it's not a question of race or background or ethnicity. Britain is one of the most open and cosmopolitan countries on the face of the earth. People from all over the world can find a community of their own right here in Britain. The issue is one of scale and speed, and the pressures on communities that brings at a time when public finances are already under severe strain as a consequence of the financial crisis. Now, this was a matter of enormous concern in our recent general election campaign, and it remains so today. And unlike some other member states, Britain's population is already expanding. Our population is set to reach over 70 million in the next decades, and we're forecast to become the most populous country in the EU by 2050. At the same time, our net migration is running at over 300,000 a year. That is not sustainable. Now, we've taken lots of steps to control immigration from outside the EU, but we need to be able to exert greater control on arrivals from inside the EU too.
In the meantime, the UKIP leader Nigel Farage has described Prime Minister David Cameron's proposed negotiation on the EU as a weak negotiating position.
I mean, he spent nearly the whole speech eulogising about the single market, saying that our economic security, our national security was safer and better inside the EU. I don't agree with him, but that's his very strong position. So right at the end, he says, if I don't get what I want, well, you know, I mean, I could possibly advocate Britain leaves. But the point is, this is not a substantial renegotiation. He isn't asking for anything other than a change to migrant benefits, on which today he's already conceded he's prepared to compromise. Other than that, he wants a list of promises on a piece of paper to be written into a future European treaty. And frankly, I think this is a very weak.
US President Barack Obama has said security in Israel remains one of his government's top foreign policy priority. The president said this while receiving Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in his Oval Office.
This is going to be an opportunity for the Prime Minister and myself to engage in a wide-ranging discussion on some of the most pressing security issues that both our countries face. It's no secret that the security environment in the Middle East has deteriorated in many areas, and as I've said repeatedly, the security of Israel is one of my top foreign policy priorities. And that has expressed itself not only in words but in deeds. We have closer military and intelligence cooperation than any two administrations in history. The military assistance that we provide, we consider not only an important part of our obligation to the security of the State of Israel, but also an important part of U.S. Security infrastructure in the region. As we make sure that one of our closest allies can not only protect itself, but can also work with us in deterring terrorism and other security threats. In light of what continues to be a chaotic situation in Syria, this will give us an opportunity to discuss what's happening there. We'll have an opportunity to discuss how we can blunt the activities of ISIL, Hezbollah, other organizations in the region that carry out terrorist attacks. A lot of our time will be spent on memorandum of understanding that we can potentially negotiate. It will be expiring in a couple of years, but we want to get a head start on that to make sure that both the United States and Israel can plan effectively for our defense needs going forward. We'll also have a chance to talk about how implementation of the Iran nuclear agreement is going. It's no secret that the Prime Minister and I have had a strong disagreement on this narrow issue, but we don't have a disagreement on the need to making sure that Iran does not get a nuclear weapon, and we don't have a disagreement about the importance of us blunting destabilizing activities that Iran may be taking place. And so we're going to be looking to make sure that we find common ground there. And we will also have an opportunity to discuss some of the concerns that both of us have around violence in the Palestinian territories. I want to be very clear that we condemn in the strongest terms Palestinian violence against innocent Israeli citizens. And I want to repeat once again, it is my strong belief that Israel has not just the right but the obligation to protect itself. I also will discuss with Prime Minister his thoughts on how we can lower the temperature between Israeli and Palestinians, how we can get back on a path towards peace, and how we can make sure that legitimate Palestinian aspirations are met through a political process.
Also, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has condemned the European Union new guidelines for labeling products made in Israeli settlements on Palestinian territories. The EU's decision requires Israeli producers to clearly label their EU exports originating from the settlements.
The new EU labeling rules affect goods produced by Israeli businesses and farms in the land Israel captured during the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. Officials in Brussels say the move is intended to clarify existing rules on goods sold in Europe, but Israelis by and large see it as anti-Semitic.
Europe should be ashamed of itself. It took an immoral decision. Of the hundreds of territorial conflicts around the world, it chose to single out Israel and Israel alone, while it's fighting its back against the wall, against the wave of terror. The European Union is not going to hurt the Israeli economy. It's strong enough to weather this.
Relations between the EU and Israel have been cooling in recent years amid Europe's growing criticism of Israel's treatment of Palestinians. A global movement called the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions that calls for pressure on Israel to end the occupation is gaining momentum among European academics, even as it is denounced by political leaders.
I cannot think of anything more foolish than to say that you want to have any kind of divestment or sanctions or whatever, or boycott against a country that, when all is said and done, is the only democracy in the region.
But Jewish settlements in the occupied territories are seen as one of the biggest obstacles to reaching a lasting peace deal in the troubled region. The anniversary of Arafat's death Wednesday was a stark reminder of how little has changed for the Palestinians since he was alive.
We reject the occupation and fight it by all the means we have. We will continue in Arafat's footsteps until the occupation ends.
Arafat died in a French hospital from what was described as a massive stroke, but many Palestinians believe his death was arranged by Israel.
In the meantime, the global economic slowdown has remained a major concern to the world's major economic powers, just as Turkey plays a host to the G20 Economic Summit.
Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan took an early tour of the summit venue Wednesday as he prepares to host his G20 counterparts. As the summit approaches, there are alarming indicators about the health of some emerging economies, including Turkey, where inflation is high and the currency struggling. But analysts say it is Russia that is suffering the most.
It's contracting by maybe 5% this year, really struggling with the collapse in the oil prices, on top of the sanctions problem, on top of the very poor governance, which has made it extremely difficult for businesses to operate there.
Growth in China has slowed to under 7%, according to official figures, prompting an equity sell-off and pushing down oil prices. But some feel the fears are overblown.
The equity market did collapse, but there'd been a bubble beforehand, and it's not really very strongly connected with actual growth in the economy.
Robust economic data from the United States have raised expectations the Federal Reserve will raise interest rates next month, compounding the problems for emerging economies. China said this week it wants the G20 to focus on reform of voting rights at the International Monetary Fund.
They are underrepresented dramatically. So at the moment the US has around 16% of the share, China only 4%, India around 3%, Brazil even 2%.
Climate change will also feature high on the G20 agenda.
Particularly because we have the Paris Summit coming up in December, and this is one of the last meetings where the big economies and the big actors also on climate change will come together.
The arrest of 20 suspected Islamic State militants in Turkey's Antalya province this week is an indication global security has been thrust to the forefront of the agenda, says the University of Toronto's John Curtin, speaking via Skype from Antalya.
Terrorism in the Middle East primarily, the Syrian refugee crisis, they're going to be dealt with by the leaders at the dinner where they meet alone can deal in a more flexible fashion.
China assumes the rotating presidency of the G20 in 2016. Analysts say Beijing will likely find its own economy is the major focus.
With our report, we conclude the news roundup for this week. Thank you for being part of the program. I'm Tunde Alabi, and do have a very good week ahead of you. Bye. As part of our continued efforts to reach the African and other ethnic communities in the United Kingdom with greater impacts and create the platform to hear your silent and unheard views in this hugely growing community in the United Kingdom, our channel, Ben TV, presents to you another live current affairs television program. Our focus on the program is to review and discuss issues around the diaspora community in the UK. The program offers you that unrestricted voice on issues affecting you in the UK. Join us live every Monday at 10 a.m. to 12 noon. Another business segment of Dialogue in Diaspora, 2 to 3 p.m. every Monday. But guess what? You know you can be part of the program. Just send us an email at bentelevisionuk@gmail.com. Dialogue in Diaspora, your voice, your opinion on our TV.